Today I'll be talking about my work with the conservation of an endangered pollinating bat in northeast Mexico. And my work is in progress, so I'll be talking about some of the progress I've made so far. So to give a little bit of a background, this is the Mexican long-nosed bat, which is an endangered species in both the US and by the IUCN. And these bats are long-distance migrators. So they migrate over 1,000 kilometers every year, the females do, between the central part of Mexico and northeast Mexico, where I'm working, and the US Southwest. And during this time, they rely on the nectar and pollen of paniculate agaves, shown here, particularly in the northern part of their range where I'm working. And also in Mexico, people use agaves for a variety of purposes, probably the most famous of which are tequila and mezcal. But there are many, many other uses, some of which are listed here. And so the bat conservation challenge comes in because for some of these important products like tequila and mezcal, the agave is castrated, which basically means the harvester hollows out a hole in the center of the plant, which prevents that tall flowering stalk from growing, and which means there's no food, there's no flowers for the bats. So this is removing the food supply, and it may be contributing to their declines. And also, some communities harvest wild agaves from wild populations. And there has been overharvest in some of these areas. And again, this can be decreasing the food supply for the bats and contributing to their declines potentially. And so the idea among bat conservationists is this idea of bat-friendly agave harvest and management. And so this could look like allowing a proportion of an agave farm to flower for the bats and then make the products that you're making with the rest of the crop, or replanting wild agaves in areas that have been harvested in the wild. And so there's been a lot of really great success with this in certain parts of Mexico. You may have heard about the new bat-friendly tequila and mezcal label. It's been getting a lot of press in National Geographic, the BBC, a lot of great press. And this is the label here. And what happens is tequila and mezcal producers set aside 5% of their crop, of their farm, to flower for the bats to feed on, and then make tequila and mezcal with the remaining 95% of the crop. And this is a collaborative project between the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the NGO, the Tequila Interchange Project. And this has been having a lot of success in central Mexico, in these red and green states on this map, where tequila and mezcal are legally allowed to be produced. However, if we overlay the range map of the Mexican long-nosed bat, we can see that they migrate through areas where tequila and mezcal are legally not allowed to be produced because of the denominations of origins of these products. However, those communities, rural communities, are still harvesting agaves on farms sometimes and also from wild populations for many of those important products. And so this bat-friendly tequila and mezcal label that's working in the central part of Mexico is not likely an appropriate strategy, and it actually can't be used in other parts of the bat's range. So we need to find locally appropriate bat conservation strategies in these other parts of the range where the bats are. And this is especially important in northeast Mexico, where two of the most important caves, roosting caves for this species, are located. So this one right here is Infierno Cave, located in Nuevo León. And this is one of only 2 confirmed maternity caves where the females give birth to and raise their pups. And this is Rosillo Cave in Coahuila, and that's another suspected maternity cave. And so trying to identify locally appropriate bat conservation strategies in these areas is very important. And so that's the goal of my work. And I'm partnering with a local conservation NGO in Mexico, Especie Sociedad y Habitat, or ASHAC. And ASHAC has been working with bat conservation projects in this region since about 2011. And I completed my ICON internship with them in my first summer here, and since then have been developing my actual research as a collaboration with them. And so the overall goal of this component of my dissertation is to first identify where to target bat-friendly agave management in northeast Mexico, and 2, to understand how to implement these strategies in those local communities. And ultimately, the goal that I hope to provide from this information is that this information can then be used to develop guidelines and recommendations that conservation groups like ASHAC can use to implement these programs. And so to do this, I'm taking a two-pronged integrative approach that includes both social and ecological components to answer these where and how questions. So the first question is, where are these bat-friendly agave management programs socially feasible? That is, which of the communities in this region would most likely be open to adopting these programs based on their current local political, social, and economic contexts? And then once we identify which communities to target, we still need to know where within the community's land is best for the bats to implement these practices, because these communities can have quite vast lands at their disposal. And so where are the programs most ecologically appropriate for the bats? Or where are the bats most likely to find these flowering agaves? And to clarify, the bat-friendly practices that I'm talking about here is flowering agaves for the bats, so planting those. And then once we know where to implement these programs, we still need to understand how, or get an idea of how to do these programs. So on the social end of this, we need to understand how can these bat-friendly practices be incentivized in each community, which may be different by varying by community. And then for the ecological end, how can we design these practices so they're the most ecologically beneficial for the bats? In other words, how many flowering agaves should we plant on a community's lands? And in what spatial configuration would be best for the bats? So to do this, for the social components, I'm conducting semi-structured interviews and participant observation with community leaders and agave harvesters to understand how they're currently harvesting and managing agaves and the current local institutions and governance structures. And then I'll be doing more of the structured questionnaires to assess these incentives and for adopting the bat-friendly practices that each community or individual people may be willing to do. And for the ecological components, I'm doing a bat foraging study using infrared cameras, and this is a still shot with a bat foraging on the flower right there. And also agave population surveys to figure out which of the agave characteristics and the landscape characteristics attract foraging bats to an area. For example, do bats feed preferentially at areas that have a high density of flowering agaves in that area, or lower densities? And then I'll be using individual-based modeling to determine the optimal spatial configuration of these flowering agaves on the landscape for the bats. And so the pilot study, this is what I did this past summer. I visited 8 sites and communities in Northeast Mexico. And these are the 8 communities here. And for the foraging study, I had 2 infrared cameras. And so I set those up on 5 different nights and monitored bat feeding visits to the flowering agave to count the number of visits to each flower, or to each agave. And then I conducted agave surveys. And while I haven't collected enough data to do actual modeling yet, well, first I'll show the video. Uh-oh. So you can see the bat come up. And they're real quick. So counting how many times they visit the flowering agave. And then I will be making those models eventually, but right now with the small data set, I can't do that yet. But it did appear, at least just from the small data set, that the bats were preferring and visiting more times at patches with higher number of flowering agaves versus more dispersed agaves. And so if this does hold true, it would indicate that we should plant agaves to flower in clumps in certain areas versus spread throughout the community's land. And then for the community work, the pilot study, I got to interview 7 community leaders, 3 agave harvesters, and 1 agave program manager. And I also trialed the questionnaire with 2 harvesters, and I will be revising those questionnaires for this coming summer. And these are just some very preliminary results again, but things that I think will have implications for adopting these bat-friendly practices or not. So in some communities, they have decreasing harvest and use of agaves. And so for various reasons. And you might think, oh, well, this is good for the bats, right? If they're not harvesting, there's more agaves. But actually that might not be the case because in some of these communities, because the people aren't harvesting agaves from those wild populations and actively using them to make products, they're instead converting that habitat and that land to other uses, for example, construction or agriculture. And so this will be important to think about in these communities. Are there opportunities for bat-friendly practices within those other land uses, or incentivizing people to keep agave habitat for the bats, potentially? And in other communities that I worked with, one particularly had increasing harvest of agaves. And they're actually now producing this destilado, which is an alcoholic beverage, and they're producing it for export now. And so in this case, where they actually have a product that they're exporting, there could potentially be the avenue of doing a bat-friendly label, not the tequila and mezcal label, but perhaps something similar in this case. And a third finding that really came up a lot among the communities that I interviewed was the importance of the Mexican government in community well-being. So many of the communities have programs that are given through either the federal or the state government. And these programs are for a variety of things, but they ultimately create jobs and bring money to the communities. And some of the programs in the communities are for harvesting agaves for products like destilado. And others are for planting agaves, for example, for erosion control. And so when thinking about these different government programs, there could potentially be an avenue for incorporating bat-friendly practices within these government programs, potentially. And so the take-home message from all of this so far is that there are unique local contexts, social, political, and economic contexts within each of these communities. And we really need to identify locally appropriate conservation strategies for these bats instead of relying on a one-size-fits-all solution. And ultimately, I hope that this work will inform the conservation and will help conservation practitioners do conservation efforts for these bats to help protect these endangered bats. And with that, I'll take any questions.
So, as pollinators of the agave, the bats must be instrumental, at least in some capacity, to the sustainability of agave as a product. Do you get a sense of how aware folks are of that?
Yeah, so actually, that was actually one of my points I had taken out, but most people weren't aware of that either bats were around, what they were, or that they fed from and pollinated agaves. And so I think education, conservation education, will be an important part of any bat conservation strategies in the future. Because, I mean, bats are out at night, and so people don't really see them. Yeah. And so they're not really aware that they're there.
That little feeding event you showed us is
yeah.
pretty quick.
Yeah, and so part of what I hope to do is part of the education that I hope to do is use the infrared cameras with the communities and show them, be like, oh look, the bats are here on your land and this is what they look like, and just part of that education. Yeah.
This might be a little premature, but do you think any of these, especially incentives that are based on a product being exported, if there were something like higher taxes to export to the United States, stuff that would impact these incentive programs? Or how affected by those kind of policies do you think these farmers might be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's part of my first chapter, is looking at these market-based incentives, the tequila and mezcal particularly, and looking at the challenges with them. And yes, there are definitely challenges. And as far as exporting, these are small communities, and they don't have a lot of capacity at this point. So I don't know if it's even an option, or if it's a route they'd want to go down. But looking at those potential options, yeah. Well, thank you.